What's the hidden meaning behind this tattoo? And how did they actually film this scene? These are 60 hidden details and behind-the-scenes facts about Venom. Jonah Jameson's name is heard as the name of the astronaut who survives the shuttle crash that brings the symbiote to Earth.
That's Jameson.
Marvel fans will know that this is actually the son of J. Jonah Jameson, the Daily Bugle editor-in-chief. In the comics, he becomes Man-Wolf after finding the Moonstone on the moon. One of the symbiote beings that makes it back to Earth in the shuttle crash is known as Riot, and when Riot takes over the Malaysian EMT, the M is ripped on her jacket to make it read as E.T. instead, referencing sci-fi film Alien, and also referring to the fact that the symbiotes are extraterrestrials themselves. Now, it's always fun to find out who could have ended up playing characters before someone is finally chosen, so before Riz Ahmed was chosen to play Carlton Drake, Pedro Pascal and Matt Smith were considered to play the role instead. On top of that, Anne Wang was almost played by another actress who went on to play another big part in the MCU. Tatiana Maslany admitted that she actually auditioned for the role of Anne, but she went on to play She-Hulk instead. Do you think she would have made a better She-Venom? Anne actually mentions that Eddie was forced to leave New York and his job at the Daily Globe.
And I'm sure that they defend many people that you don't deem worthy, but we don't want to repeat of the Daily Globe incident.
Ow!
And this ties the film to the comics, since Eddie was a photographer at the Daily Globe, which was a rival paper to the Daily Bugle. Eddie had to leave the paper after interviewing a compulsive confessor who claimed to be the real Sin Eater. When Eddie sneaks onto Anne's computer, you can see an email heading that reads Bodhi, and this is the name of a character that Riz Ahmed played in Rogue One prior to starring in this film. While Eddie is still going through Anne's computer and opens the confidential files, you can see that one of the unread emails talks about a Mr. McCurdy, and this is actually a reference to the Marvel Comics colorist, inker, and penciler, Bowen McCurdy. In the confidential email about the 3 murders that Life Foundation is trying to cover up, Anne's firm is named Michelini McFarlane, and this was done this way to reference the creators of the Venom comics, David Michelini and Todd McFarlane. But while pretty much all of the main and side characters are taken straight from the comic book source material, Jenny Slate's character, Dora Skirth, was a completely original character created in order to help progress the story without all the exposition. The security guard scene towards the beginning of the film is played by Emilio Rivera, and this is the same actor who played one of the police officers seen in Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man 3, which also featured its own special version of Venom. Venom is one of the more recognizable characters in the Spider-Man universe, and this film made such a big impact in cinema that when a new spider species was discovered in 2023, the spider was classified as Venomius Tom Hardy. It even has black and white spots on its thorax that look like Venom. And while Tom Hardy seems like the perfect actor to play Eddie Brock, he almost ended up playing another big Marvel character. It turns out that he was considered to play Doctor Strange in the MCU first, but I couldn't see anyone other than Benedict Cumberbatch playing that character now. After filming this first film in the franchise, Tom Hardy ended up having a lot of physical issues due to the stunts, and even though he's no stranger to action films, he had to have 2 knee surgeries that he was still recovering from while filming the sequel. Even though Eddie Brock and Venom are usually seen as villains in New York City, this film decided to take them to San Francisco to play as more of an anti-hero. And this version is based off of the Lethal Protector comic series instead of the version seen in Spider-Man comics. As for the villain of this film, Carlton Drake shows how much of a hypocrite he is as he first tells a little girl,
They try and silence those of us who ask questions.
and moments later, he's the one who silences Eddie Brock when he asks a rather condemning question.
The actual legal cases like Sarah Chambers, Bill Barkley.
And we can take notice that Carlton Drake is pulling a lot of the strings through multiple sources as he tells Eddie,
Have a nice life.
and right after this, Eddie is fired by his boss for asking Carlton some hair-raising questions, and his boss passes the message on to him as he says,
Have a nice life.
and this isn't the last time that we get to hear this memorable saying as Venom and Eddie Brock are able to get their revenge on Carlton and Riot at the end of the film during their climactic battle, and they tell Carlton,
Have a nice life.
The fact that Venom tells Carlton Drake this little quip right before defeating him proves that Venom is also able to access Eddie's memories, as he wanted to make sure that Carlton knew that it was Eddie who was really getting his revenge for ruining his life after getting him fired. And ironically enough, even though Carlton is head of the Life Foundation, which is supposedly dedicated to bettering life on Earth, Carlton doesn't care about anyone aside from himself. And it's apparent when the subject dies in front of him and he says,
Get it out of my sight.
Even the Foundation's researchers don't seem to have a very good grasp on what counts as stable conditions for living, as the researchers are heard saying,
His vitals are holding steady.
but the vitals for the subject shows a high pulse of 136 and a dangerously low oxygen saturation of 81%. And Carlton Drake really considers himself to be something of a god, as he first mentions that,
I would argue that God has abandoned us.
but shortly after this he claims to be something like God, as he says,
This time, I will not abandon us.
On the other side of things, Eddie Brock is so desperate to find work that he texts Barney Bushkin to keep an eye out for work. But Barney tells him that he doesn't have anything. Barney Bushkin is actually the editor of the previous newspaper he worked for called The Daily Globe. In order to show how much Eddie needs a job, he offers to use a pseudonym and act like a woman while referencing Tootsie if he's able to get the job.
I can use a pseudonym. Any name. Think you pick a name. I could be a woman. You sing Tootsie.
And this is a reference to the 1982 movie Tootsie, where the main character acts like a woman in order to secure a job. After Eddie is infected with Venom, they rush back to his apartment where they eat frozen tater tots out of the freezer. And this is the first thing that Venom eats after achieving symbiosis. The experience stuck with him so much that he mentions that they should get some frozen tater tots and chocolate at the end of the film as well.
So, what culinary delights will tickle the pickle tonight?
Tater tots and chocolate.
And Venom seems to have a hankering for chocolate throughout the film. And this was first referenced in the 1995 miniseries Venom: The Hunger, where he explains that chocolate and brains are an excellent source of the chemical called phenethylamine, which he needs to sustain himself. As a way to make the relationship and interaction between Eddie and Venom seem more believable and easier to act out, Tom Hardy recorded his lines as Venom beforehand so that they could be played back to him, and he actually acted out his scenes while responding to his recordings. While we're still set in Eddie's apartment, a bench press can be seen as the main piece of workout equipment in Eddie's home. And while this is a common home gym piece, this is actually a reference to Eddie's apartment in the comics, where the bench press was a hotspot for the character while thinking. When Eddie is struggling against Venom to keep control of his body, Tom Hardy and director Rubin have revealed that they actually drew inspiration from Steve Martin in All of Me from 1994 as a way to show the physicality of it. And during the first fight scene right after this, the stuntman who does all of the stunts throughout is the same one who did the stunts for Chadwick Boseman in the Black Panther films, and his name is Daniel Graham. Later on, when Eddie looks at his reflection to find Venom staring back at him, he mentions,
You have a brain tumor, Eddie.
and this is actually a reference to the comics, where he did end up having a brain tumor in one of the multiple storylines laid out for the character. And the comics show that he actually already developed the tumor before he bonded with Venom. Eddie Brock actually realizes that his powers come from Venom in a similar manner to the way Peter Parker finds out about his Spider-Man powers. It seems as though Sony has a thing for characters finding out about their true powers in the middle of some alley. The apartment building that Eddie lives in is called Schuler.
I got him. He's in the alley behind the Schuler building.
And this is a reference to Randy Schuler. Randy was a huge Marvel Comics fan who suggested that Spider-Man have a black costume back in 1982. And his idea was bought by the editor-in-chief, Jim Shooter, for $220. The costume debuted in The Amazing Spider-Man number 252. And another inspiration from the comics happens when we hear Venom mention
Eyes, lungs, pancreas. So many snacks, so little time.
And this quote was actually taken straight out of The Amazing Spider-Man number 374. An additional cool tidbit is that Venom actually looks at the parts of the body where the organs are located as he says them. Originally, Venom has a makeshift spider design on his body in the comics, but Sony decided not to do this in this film since it's a standalone movie that doesn't exist in the Marvel universe. So they decided to go with a V for Venom's name instead. And when we see Venom make an appearance as a separate head formed outside of Eddie's ribs, this is actually a way that Venom makes himself known in the comics, as well as a way to speak to Eddie without simply communicating in his head. Later on, when we see Eddie leave his phone on the desk upstairs, it's supposed to be in the topmost story, which would be the 48th story. But when he gets into the elevator, it clearly indicates that he's only on the 8th floor instead. Interestingly enough, this is one of the few films based off of a Marvel Comics property that acknowledges anything within the DC universe. When it's found out that sound and fire are the symbiote's weakness, Anne mentions
Sound is like his kryptonite?
as a reference to Superman's weakness. But according to the characters in the film, the frequency that is harmful to the symbiotes is anywhere between 4-6 kHz, and they tried to show this in the MRI scan. This isn't factual at all though, since MRIs use electromagnetic waves instead of sonic waves, which are harmful to the symbiotes. And while the MRI being used as a means to hurt the symbiotes isn't factual, when the plane flies overhead and disrupts the symbiote, this is more factual since plane engines have a sonic frequency of about 4,100 Hz, and this falls within the acceptable range that was described earlier in the film. When we see Anne merge with Venom temporarily to save Eddie, this was a part of the storyline that was taken straight out of the comics where she becomes She-Venom for a short amount of time. In fact, Venom finally gets to bite a guy's head off while he's merged with Anne. And this was actually what led to Anne's demise in the comics, as she couldn't live with the guilt of eating and killing people. After the guilt of her actions became too much for her to live with, she ended up jumping out of her apartment window to end it all. While this film shows Riot and Carlton Drake as being the joint main antagonist in this film, they were actually two completely separate entities in the comics, with Carlton Drake actually becoming Homo Arachnus after finding out that he had terminal cancer. And Riot was created by Carlton as he merged him with a mercenary to hunt down Venom and Spider-Man. During the big battle at the end, we can see Riot ripping Venom off of Eddie Brock, and in the comics, it was actually Carnage who had his moment to do this. You can see this as a reference to Venom, Carnage Unleashed number 3. Stan Lee's cameo in this film is monumental in the sense that this was the last cameo he filmed that was played in a film that was released while he was still alive. His health was already failing at the time, and he died shortly after this on November 18th, 2018. You can actually spot a reference to another Marvel comic writer though as we look at the signs on the street level. You can see a store called Ron Lim Herbal, and this is a reference to Ron Lim, who worked on Spider-Man, The Avengers, and Silver Surfer. The end credit sequence actually hints to Carnage even more, as the first section of the creative credits are in black and white, but shortly after that, the credits are seen in black and red, which are Carnage's classic colors. The prison that Eddie visits to interview Cletus Cassidy is San Quentin Prison, and this is actually the same prison that the Punisher was kept at for murdering Spider-Man. And Scott Lang was also kept here after breaking into his boss's house, stealing funds, and wrecking his car. Originally, Carnage was going to be the main villain for this film, but they decided to postpone the character's involvement for the sequel, and Woody Harrelson was easily able to film his cameo appearance for the post-credit scene, since the scene was shot on the set for Zombieland Double Tap. When we see the symbiotes that were retrieved from the crash, you can see that they are each a different color. Venom came from the black one. Riot moves on to be the big baddie, Phage is the yellow symbiote seen in the Life Foundation, and Toxin is the blue one seen next to it. Later in the film, Venom bonds with a dog briefly as a way to escape and survive. And this is a reference to a moment in the comics where a Venom symbiote bonds with a sleigh dog named Ivan. Even though Eddie starts off this film being engaged to Anne Wang, you can see that he has a wolf tattooed on his left arm, and this is to represent his lone wolf mentality that is soon to come before Venom intervenes and spends the rest of his time with him. The kiss between She-Venom and Eddie Brock was one of the weirder moments of the film, and later on Anne mentions that it was the symbiote's idea.
That was your buddy's idea.
This just refers to the straightforward love Eddie and Venom have for one another in the comics, where they've actually had a kid together. In the film, Riot is shown to be able to create all sorts of weapons from an infinite arsenal. But in the comics, he's only able to create blunt melee objects such as maces. In order to make him an all-inclusive villain for the film, he was given the ability to create sharp and projectile weapons as well. When you see Eddie Brock get into the lobster tank, this was actually a bit that had been improvised by Tom Hardy. The vegan actor definitely didn't bite into a real lobster though. It was actually made from candy-shelled marshmallow and was filled with chocolate syrup. In order to achieve the proper movement animation for the movements seen in Venom's symbiote, the VFX team had to study the movements of slime molds, jellyfish, and amoeba to assure the flow of Venom matched a realistic factor they deemed necessary. This isn't Tom's first superhero film though, as he actually played Bane in The Dark Knight Rises before this film, and funnily enough, his character in that film injects himself with a serum that gives him superhero strength, and the serum is known as Venom. The airport where we see the old woman take over the body of the little girl in the bathroom before getting on the plane wasn't actually in Asia like it's shown. The airport was actually the Georgia World Congress Center in Atlanta. The mission control room was actually inspired by a real-life location. In order to prepare for creating the sets, Ruben Fleischer visited SpaceX as a way to draw inspiration, and this is why the mission control room has such a modern setting. According to Dora Skirth, there were a plethora of actors and actresses who auditioned for the role of Jenny, and she felt honored to be the one to get it, even though the character wasn't her usual forte. Originally, men and women auditioned for the role, seeing how the character was written to be a male, but after seeing Dora's audition, they decided to make her Jenny. Originally, Venom is known to bond with Eddie in a way that he was actually a second layer disguised as Eddie's clothes. But in this film, they decided to take the bond a step further by making Venom into a part of Eddie's body after bonding with him. While many people believe that Tom Hardy embodied Eddie Brock so well, he is actually quite different when you look at physicality. Tom Hardy is 5 foot 9 inches with dark brown hair, and Eddie Brock in the comics was actually 6 foot 3 inches with strawberry blonde hair.